Audio by Paper to Audio. At Christmas dinner, my daughter-in-law slammed her wine glass onto the table, turned toward me with cold, glittering eyes, and snapped, "Either you give your room to my mother, or pack your bags and get out." She didn't lower her voice. She didn't whisper it under her breath like someone with even a fragment of decency. She announced it loudly, deliberately, right in the middle of a Christmas dinner I had spent 3 days preparing in a home my late husband and I had built together with 40 years of sacrifice, love, and honest work. Sandra glared at me from across the table, her lips curled into a smirk so sharp it could cut glass, while her mother, Patricia, sat beside her with the satisfied expression of a woman who had already mentally moved into my bedroom. My son, David, sat at the head of the table where his father used to sit, staring down at his plate, saying absolutely nothing. The Christmas tree I had decorated still twinkled in the corner. My late husband's photograph still hung on the wall. And not one person at that table said a word in my defense. But I, Margaret Calloway, a 67-year-old retired property accountant, did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not waste a single breath arguing with people who had spent 2 years mistaking my patience for weakness and my generosity for surrender. Instead, I set my fork down quietly, pressed my napkin against the corner of my mouth, and rose from my chair with my spine perfectly straight. "All right," I said, with a calm so absolute it seemed to unsettle the room. "I'll go and pack." They thought they were putting a tired old woman out onto the cold street on Christmas night. What none of them understood, not Sandra with her entitlement, not Patricia with her hungry eyes, not even my own son with his cowardly silence, was that while they had been busy crowning themselves the rulers of my house, I had already been quietly holding the keys to something far more powerful than any of them could imagine. A legal reality so airtight it would bring the entire house of cards they had built crashing down around their dinner table. If stories of quiet dignity, hard-won justice, and a grandmother who refused to be erased speak to something in your soul, stay with me. Because 3 days after that Christmas dinner, I was settling into a brand new home of my own, while they were about to receive the most devastating wake-up call of their comfortable lives. The December night air bit at my cheeks as I carried my 2 suitcases out through the front door of the house on Birchwood Lane without a single tear. The Christmas lights my late husband Edward had strung along the eaves every December for 38 years without fail blinked cheerfully above me, indifferent to the quiet devastation happening beneath them. I loaded my bags into the trunk of my car, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway without looking in the rearview mirror. I drove to a small, clean inn on the edge of town called the Hearthstone, a place I had passed 1,000 times over the years without ever imagining I would one day need it. The woman at the front desk handed me a room key with a warm smile, and I carried my suitcases upstairs alone, the way I had learned to carry most things in the years since Edward passed. When the door clicked shut behind me and the silence of the room pressed in around me, I did not collapse. I sat on the edge of the bed, opened the small leather notebook I kept in my handbag, and began to write down everything I needed to do, methodically, clearly, the way I had always approached a complicated ledger. Because here is what Sandra never understood about marrying into a family without bothering to understand it. She had moved her husband and herself, and eventually her mother, into a house belonging entirely to a woman who had spent 30 years as a property accountant. A woman who understood titles, deeds, equity, and estate law the way a surgeon understands anatomy. I opened my banking application on my telephone and reviewed my personal savings account, a sum I had built quietly and carefully over decades of professional discipline and modest living. The balance read $187,000, money completely separate from any household account, money that Sandra had never once considered might exist, because she had always assumed that a woman my age sitting quietly in her kitchen was a woman without options. She was wrong. I scrolled back through my messages until I found a conversation with my oldest friend, Gloria Hutchins. Gloria had retired 2 years prior from a 30-year career as a licensed residential property consultant. For the better part of 18 months, she had been sending me listings. Gently, persistently, the way a good friend nudges you toward something she can see that you cannot yet see for yourself. There was one property she had flagged 3 weeks earlier that I had dismissed with a polite thank you and a heavy heart, telling myself I needed to stay in the family home because leaving would feel like abandoning Edward's memory. I pulled up the listing now in the quiet of that in-room. A single-story cottage on a peaceful residential lane called Fernwood Close, lined with mature oak trees and set back from the road behind a low stone wall. 3 bedrooms, a sun-filled kitchen with original tilework, a back garden large enough for the roses I had always dreamed of planting, listed at $310,000. With $187,000 in savings, I had enough for a down payment exceeding 60%. My pension income, combined with the modest investment dividends I had accumulated over the years, was more than sufficient to satisfy any mortgage lender's requirements. I would finish the purchase comfortably, with a meaningful financial cushion still intact. I typed a message to Gloria at 10:30 on Christmas night. Can we see that Fernwood Close cottage first thing tomorrow morning? Her reply came within minutes, which told me she had been awake, probably worrying about me. I'll have the agent there at 9. Get some rest, Margaret. Everything is about to get better. I set the telephone on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, and lay in the darkness listening to the muffled sound of the town settling into its Christmas night quiet. For the first time in 2 years, since the day Sandra had arrived in my home with her mother's suitcases and her redecorating opinions and her quiet campaign to erase every trace of my existence from my own house, I felt something unfamiliar and extraordinary spreading through my chest. It felt like the first breath, after a very long time underwater. 5 days later, I stood on the back step of my new home on Fernwood Close, holding a cup of tea in both hands, watching a robin investigate the frost-stiffened lawn with businesslike intensity. The brass keys were in the pocket of my cardigan. The closing documents were signed. The wire transfer was complete. The cottage smelled of old wood and dried lavender, and the particular quiet that belongs only to homes that have been loved and cared for over many decades. The kitchen tiles were exactly as beautiful in person as they had been in the photographs. The back garden was larger than I had imagined. There was already a climbing rose against the back fence, dormant now in December, but unmistakably alive. I stood there in the pale winter sunlight and thought of Edward. I thought of how he used to say that home was not the walls around you, but the peace inside you. And I thought that he would have approved deeply, warmly, without reservation, of exactly what I had done and exactly what I was about to do next. That same afternoon, I kept an appointment I had scheduled 2 days earlier with a solicitor named Mr. Gerald Ockhaffer, whose office occupied a quiet suite above a bookshop in the town center. Gerald was a property law specialist with 31 years of experience in estate disputes and inheritance litigation. He had been recommended to me by my former colleague at the accounting firm where I had worked for 22 years, and his reputation was impeccable. I sat across from him, placed a manila envelope on his desk, and explained everything in precise, unhurried detail. Edward had passed away 14 months ago. In the immediate fog of grief, I had allowed David and Sandra to move into the house. My house, the house Edward and I had purchased together in 1987, under the mutual understanding that they were there to provide support and share household responsibilities. No formal agreement had been signed. No tenancy had been established. What had begun as a compassionate arrangement had been gradually, methodically transformed by Sandra into a takeover, culminating in a Christmas dinner eviction demand issued to the woman whose name appeared on the original property deed. Gerald reviewed the title documents with careful attention, cross-referencing the deed of ownership against the estate records. He set his glasses on the desk, folded his hands, and looked at me with the composed expression of a man delivering information that is both serious and completely unambiguous. The property on Birchwood Lane, he confirmed, had been registered in both my name and Edward's at the time of purchase, and under the terms of the original joint tenancy arrangement, full legal ownership had passed entirely to me upon Edward's death, automatically, without contest, without condition. My name alone appeared on the current title. Sandra held no legal interest in the property whatsoever. David held no legal claim. Patricia had never held so much as a foothold. My son and his wife were, in the precise language of property law, unlicensed occupants residing at my discretion in a home they had never owned and had no right to occupy without my continued permission. A permission I was now formally withdrawing. Based on comparable properties recently sold on Birchwood Lane, the house was currently appraised at $490,000. Gerald drafted a formal notice to vacate that same afternoon, a legally binding document requiring David, Sandra, and Patricia to vacate the premises within 30 days or face formal eviction proceedings. The notice was sent by certified post the following morning, delivered directly into Sandra's hands on a gray Tuesday afternoon in early January. I kept my mouth completely shut about all of it. I was sitting in the sunroom of my Fernwood cottage 4 days later, reading a novel for the first time in years, when my telephone began vibrating insistently across the side table. Sandra's name appeared on the screen. I watched it ring. I watched it go to voicemail. I made myself a fresh cup of tea. Then the messages began arriving. First from Sandra, a torrent of furious, disbelieving sentences demanding to know what I thought I was doing, accusing me of losing my mind in my grief, insisting that Gerald Aucaffer's letter was a misunderstanding that needed to be corrected immediately. Then from David, whose messages were shorter, but laced with the particular wounded tone of a man who had expected his silence at the Christmas table to have no consequences. And then, nestled between the fury, something almost comical. Sandra had sent a detailed grocery list, copied apparently from some previous habit, requesting that I transfer funds to cover a supermarket order that included luxury cheese, expensive wine, and a custom-baked New Year's cake. The entitlement was so breathtaking I actually laughed aloud, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and uncomplicated, for the first time in longer than I could remember. I typed back a single sentence: manage your own grocery expenses from now on. Then I opened my banking application and did something I should have done months earlier. Shortly after David and Sandra had moved in, I had added Sandra's name as an authorized user on one of my credit accounts to handle what I had imagined would be shared household necessities. The account had instead been used with remarkable creativity for restaurant meals, clothing deliveries, and a weekend at a hotel spa that I had never been invited to. With 4 deliberate taps on my telephone screen, I permanently revoked her authorized access and canceled the associated card. The system updated instantly. 35 minutes later, my telephone rang. It was Sandra, calling from what I could hear was the checkout line of a supermarket, her voice climbing the register of outrage with every syllable. The card had been declined. There had apparently been a scene. She demanded to know what had gone wrong with my account and insisted I call the bank immediately to resolve the error. I waited until she had finished. Then I told her, quietly and without drama, that there was no error, that the card had been canceled, that my financial support of her household was finished, that I would suggest she use her own funds to complete her shopping, and I wished her a pleasant afternoon. I ended the call while she was still forming her response. Patricia called next, Patricia, who had sat at my Christmas table eating the food I had cooked while scheming to occupy my bedroom, who now wanted to appeal to me as one older woman to another, speaking in a soft, wheedling voice about the cold weather and the difficulty of finding suitable accommodation and the importance of family pulling together in difficult times. I listened to approximately 45 seconds of this before I told her, with complete courtesy, that I was not her family, that my home was no longer available to her, and that Gerald Aucaffer's office would be the appropriate point of contact for any further questions regarding the Birchwood Lane property. I hung up, refilled my tea, and returned to my novel. The 30-day notice period expired on a Wednesday morning in late January. David had made one serious attempt at a private conversation, driving to Fernwood Close and sitting in his car outside my gate for 20 minutes before sending a text asking if we could talk. I had replied through Gerald's office with a formal acknowledgement that all communication regarding the Birchwood Lane property should be directed to my legal representative. Gerald informed me that Sandra had made 2 frantic phone calls to his office during the notice period, both times attempting to negotiate extensions, alternate arrangements, or some creative legal interpretation that might allow them to remain in the house. Gerald had responded to each call with the same composed professionalism, restating the terms of the notice and the legal consequences of noncompliance. On the 31st day, with the formal eviction process formally initiated, David and Sandra finally vacated the property, taking with them the furniture they had purchased and leaving behind, I was told, a considerable amount of mess and a broken towel rail in the guest bathroom. I drove to Birchwood Lane on a quiet Thursday morning to assess the property's condition before meeting with an estate agent to list it for sale. Walking through the rooms of the house where I had lived for 36 years, I expected to feel something complicated. Grief, perhaps, or nostalgia so sharp it might undo the composure I had worked hard to maintain. Instead, I felt something simpler and more powerful. I felt free. The house sold within 11 days of listing to a young couple who had spent every available weekend searching for exactly this kind of home. A house with character, with a proper garden, with rooms that had been lived in and loved. They offered full asking price. The sale closed smoothly, the funds settled swiftly, and after all legal costs and agent fees were deducted, I deposited a sum that allowed me to pay off the mortgage on the Fernwood cottage entirely, and still have more than enough remaining to establish a retirement fund that would carry me comfortably for the rest of my life. I transferred none of it to Sandra, not a single penny. The messages that followed the sale were something to behold. Sandra, who had apparently been tracking the property listing online and had seen the sale completed, sent a series of messages so spectacular in their audacity that I saved them purely for the extraordinary record they represented. She suggested that as David's wife, she held a moral claim to a share of the proceeds. She accused me of deliberate financial cruelty. She informed me that she intended to consult her own solicitor, a threat Gerald later told me she had indeed pursued briefly before the solicitor in question explained to her the precise meaning of the word title and the precise value of the claim she did not have. David sent a shorter message. It contained an apology, the kind of apology that is really a request for money wrapped in the language of remorse, acknowledging that things had perhaps gotten out of hand at Christmas, without addressing the specific fact that he had sat in silence while his wife evicted his mother on the evening. I had spent 3 days preparing a celebration for the family. I read his message carefully. I considered it for the better part of an afternoon. Then I placed my telephone face down on the kitchen table, went out into my back garden, and spent an hour in the thin January sunlight cutting back the climbing rose against the fence, preparing it, the way the gardening book I had bought suggested, for the extraordinary bloom it would produce in spring. I did not reply to David's message that day, nor the next, nor the one after that. Eventually, I composed a response that was brief and final. I told him that I loved him because he was my son and that would never change. But I also told him that love without respect was a language I was no longer willing to translate, and that until he was prepared to demonstrate the former properly, I had nothing further to discuss. I blocked Sandra's number. I blocked Patricia's number. I did both with the same steady hands that had signed the Fernwood Close closing documents and the Gerald Ockhafer retainer agreement and 38 years of Christmas cards to people who had mattered. 3 months later, on a morning in late April, Gloria Hutchins sat across from me at the small table on my back patio, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, her sunglasses pushed up onto her head as she watched the climbing rose, which had, just as the gardening book had promised, produced an extraordinary bloom. Deep pink flowers, layered and extravagant, climbing the fence in a cascade that made the whole garden smell like something from a different century. "You look like yourself again," Gloria said. "The real one, not the one who was disappearing." I thought about that for a moment. The one who was disappearing. It was the most accurate description anyone had ever given to the 2 years I had spent in that house with Sandra's relentless campaign of quiet diminishment, her mother's hungry eyes, and my son's careful neutrality. Gerald had sent a final summary update the previous week. David and Sandra, stretched thin by the cost of renting a flat in a town where they had no equity and no financial cushion, had apparently separated, not permanently, perhaps, but significantly enough to require David to spend 2 months sleeping in the spare room of a university friend while they negotiated the terms of their shared disappointment. Sandra's mother, Patricia, had moved in with a sister in another county. The collaborative infrastructure of entitlement they had constructed around my resources had, without those resources to sustain it, dismantled with remarkable efficiency. Gavin, Sandra's younger brother who had been present at the Christmas dinner and had watched the entire scene with the entertained expression of a spectator, had apparently reached out to David to say, and this was relayed to me third-hand by Gloria, who had heard it from the wife of my former colleague, that Sandra had gone too far. That even he had known it at the time. That the look on my face when I stood up from that table was not the look of a woman who had lost. He was right about that. I reached across the patio table and poured more coffee into Gloria's mug, and then my own. The roses moved slightly in the morning breeze. Somewhere in the garden next door, a child was laughing at something with complete and uncomplicated abandon. I had done what I had promised myself in that inn room on Christmas night. I had honored Edward, not by clinging to walls and rooms and a postcode, not by allowing his home to become the stage for someone else's greed, but by protecting the thing he had actually left me. The financial discipline he had always admired in me. The self-possession he had loved. The absolute, unshakable knowledge of my own worth that he had spent 40 years gently insisting I claim. Edward's true legacy had never been bricks and mortar on Birchwood Lane. It was the woman sitting on the patio of Fernwood Close on an April morning, watching roses bloom in her own garden, entirely at peace. I had spent 2 years allowing people to treat my patience as a personal failing and my generosity as a resource to be harvested. I had allowed my son's silence to make me smaller than I was. I had stayed past the point of reason out of loyalty to a memory, without understanding that the best way to honor a memory is not endurance. It is becoming. I was no longer the woman who disappeared. I had taken the quiet fury of a Christmas night eviction and turned it, with steady hands and clear eyes and a very good solicitor, into the foundation of a life I had somehow never quite given myself permission to build until that moment. Sandra had meant to shame me. She had instead done me the most significant favor of my late life. She had made leaving not just possible, but necessary. She had removed every remaining reason to stay small. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The morning was warm and full of light. The roses were absolutely magnificent. I was 67 years old. I owned my home outright. I had a garden and a friend across the table, and a novel on the side table inside, and not a single person in my life who did not deserve to be there. I had never, in the whole of my long life, felt more completely like myself. I lifted my face toward the April sun, closed my eyes for just a moment, and let it in the warmth, the quiet, the extraordinary, unhurried peace of a woman who knows her worth so thoroughly that no one will ever again mistake her silence for surrender. I was not leaving anything behind me. I was walking, finally and entirely, toward everything that was mine. If this story of quiet strength and hard-won dignity moved you, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it today. You are never too old to choose yourself, and it is never too late to begin. You have reached the end of the text.